Today about making the web faster, so a lot of different web performance techniques. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'll just point out there's my Twitter, my email, and blog information. I do have the slides and the code are going to be available. I have a link at the end where you can get that. All of the demos are going to be just pure HTML, so it doesn't matter what framework you're used to using. All of these techniques apply to all the different ways that you might develop websites. So again, I'll show that link at the very end, and I've got two sets of code in there. So I've created a fictional travel website, and I have a before version and an after version. So the before is without normal performance techniques, and the after I've applied most of the things that we're going to talk about, and I'll show you demos of that throughout the talk. For general performance rules, I was a little surprised. So I work on an e-commerce site full-time, and I am a C# developer, and I used to work on compilers. So when I came to look at web performance, I was kind of expecting I would be doing C# tweaks and trying to make my server-side code faster. And years ago, Steve Soeters had written a very important book on web performance, and he did a lot of research and basically said for most websites, 80 to 90% of the time is spent waiting for your page resources. So it's really not my server-side code that's the problem. It's all the images, JavaScript, CSS, fonts, all of those other things. So that's what we're going to focus on in this talk. I'll show you how you can tell if you happen to actually have a server-side speed problem, but for most people that's not really where we're going to focus or spend time on, so we're focused on all these other things. There's three high-level rules then for performance. You want to make fewer HTTP requests, so we basically don't want to request things we don't need to. I put this in italics because in HTTP 1.1 we did a lot of techniques specifically to reduce the number of requests that we made. Now that HTTP 2 is out, a lot of those are unnecessary. So I put that in italics just to say, don't request things you don't need. That's still a good rule. But we're also not intentionally trying to use techniques that lower the number of requests by combining things together. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We want to send as little as possible. So we're going to do a lot of optimization around the different file types. We also want to send it as infrequently as possible. So those are the three things that all of the rules we talk about are going to come back to. I want to mention Fiddler because I use this tool a lot throughout this particular talk. So if you haven't seen it, it's a tracing tool built specifically for HTTP. So Eric Lawrence used to work on the clip art team at Microsoft, and back then he had people that would purchase clip art and needed to download it and it wouldn't work. And his team found there was no real good way back then. Microsoft's Network Monitor was probably the most popular. It worked, but it wasn't very convenient. So he basically spent weekends, he didn't know C#, didn't know .NET, didn't know HTTP, decided he was going to solve the problem and wrote Fiddler, which I think is pretty amazing. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012. I gave you a link here where you can get it, and I just wanted to tell you a lot of people use Fiddler, so if you use it today and didn't know, they have a new Fiddler Everywhere. So I'll show you briefly what that looks like. So if you come out to that link, you can now download it, but Fiddler Everywhere is basically a cross-platform implementation of Fiddler for basically the first time. There used to be a version that ran on Macs and Linux, but it never really worked that well. They have now consolidated it into a single cross-platform tool. So you can run Fiddler on a Mac, on Windows where you traditionally have, and on Linux. So again, I'll show you briefly in case you haven't seen it before. We'll just see how we will make these requests. So I'm going to open up Fiddler. I'll show you the fictional site we have for the before and after. So again, it's just a pretty typical site. I'm not a web designer by any means, so I just use Bootstrap. I think this is relatively typical. So I've got a carousel at the top, some images, some other content. So that's the before version. This is my after version. So the important thing is visually it looks the same, But if we go over and look at how it looks in Fiddler, here's my before. What I like to do in Fiddler, there's a lot of things once you're familiar with performance techniques that I'll look for in here. But the thing I want to start with is the statistics. So the before version had about 12 requests. You can see it was about 3 meg, which unfortunately is not that atypical today. Typical websites are about 100 requests and around 3 meg. If I look at the after version, however, see that it visually looked the same. I have 13 requests, but I got it down to 187K. So basically we went from almost 3 meg. If you look at that 187, that's smaller than jQuery was, and smaller than Bootstrap, and definitely smaller than all of the other images we had before. So that's the reason we want to do performance. You can see it makes drastic improvements to the size footprint, and that has an impact on all of the speed as well. So that's Fiddler. That's the site we're going to use throughout the talk. When you look at performance, you want to decide what metrics you're going to use. There's a lot of different metrics available. So I look at first byte from an IT perspective. So when I talked about server speed, I want to see how fast from the browser going to the server running my ASP.NET page, and getting back the first byte of HTML. If that number is large, I do have a server-side problem, right? I did have a couple pages on my website that was too slow. So I needed to spend time on my back-end code and optimizing that with caching and other techniques on the server. But the main one that I use today is called Speed Index. Speed Index is meant to be a representation of really how many milliseconds it took to paint the above the fold content. So when they talk about above the fold, it's basically on my device, whatever's in the current viewport. So there's still content down below I need to scroll to. This is just measuring how fast was the main content on the page visible, which is what I think is important from a user perspective. There's other ones. How early is the time, is the page interactive? The traditional one was on load. And then there's also fully loaded, which just means absolutely everything has been downloaded. I'll mention that Chrome has come out recently with what they call Web Vitals, which is a combination of how well the page paints, how soon you can start to interact with things, and whether or not things are shifting around. So this is one I'm keeping an eye on, but today I'm still using Speed Index. So it's important just to choose a metric. I'll show you the Speed Index as we go throughout this talk. It's also important to know how to measure. So I like to use webpagetest.org. I'm going to show you some demos of that with my before and after site. And what it lets you do is they have computers, both phones and browsers all over the world, that I can go connect to, point at my URL, and I can see timings and waterfalls and everything else. I'm also going to show you Fiddler, so we saw that already. Some of the diagnostics I can do with that. There's also 2 classes of measurements. So the first one is called synthetic monitoring. So we've been doing this for many years. They call it lab data, which just means I use Dynatrace now, and they happen to have servers throughout the United States that are watching my home page every hour. So it's like every 15 minutes they hit my home page, they keep track of it. Synthetic is nice because it's the same servers every time. So when I make a performance improvement, I can do a nice clean measurement and say, last week it was this week all these agents are here, and I can get a good number with consistent clients. I also, however, want to use real user monitoring. I don't have this yet, but I'm eager to get this for our website. And what it lets you do is it gives you what they call field data, which is basically all of the users that use my website. I can see all of their experiences. So not just a few agent computers, but everyone who comes to my site, I'll get a detailed breakdown of everything that they did. So let's look at what web page test looks like. So if I come out here again, if I go to webpagetest.org, I can type in a URL, I can choose a test location. So like I said, they have a lot of different locations. You can also, they have private instances. So you can actually go set up your own instance of this if you want to on your own premises to measure in like intranet sites, or if you just want to have your own devices. So I've done this ahead of time. I hosted my before and after out in Azure, and I just want to show you how you would use this. So this is the before version. We talked a lot about the different kind of metrics. There's a lot of metrics here that I could look at. Again, I'm going to focus on this speed index. So my before version of the site, when I ran this from Nebraska using Chrome on a cable modem, was about 5.5 seconds. Here are the new Chrome vitals you saw, and then the complete page was done at about 7.571 seconds. So what's cool about web page test, I can click into this waterfall diagram, and if you haven't seen these before, it just gives me a breakdown of here was the HTML request, and I can click on this and see it took 141 seconds to do the DNS lookup, the connection. It needed, in this case, I'm using HTTP, and then it just talks about download speed. So I can look back at this and see I got my HTML, I needed to get some JavaScript files. You can see how long that took. I needed to get the CSS file, and this is the important one. CSS is going to block the rendering of my page. So the fact that it took almost 4 seconds to get my CSS file is going to make sure that my speed index is somewhere out here. And then we can also see the images that we have on the page are pretty decent size because they're taking 2 seconds or 3 seconds to download. If I roll down, I can look at connections. I'm using HTTP, and so I'm using HTTP 1.1 in that case, and that uses 6 connections per host. But the bad news is each time it has to reestablish that connection. So again, this is useful. You can dig into the details of your particular page. What I want to look at here, it's often helpful to show my internal marketing staff. They like to see things visually. So here is a video of what a customer's experience would be like. And you can see it started to do some painting, but since it didn't have my CSS, it took about 5.8 seconds again. If I were to go and look at my after version, you can see they've graded. I've scored a lot better. My Azure host I need to do a little security work on. But the important thing is we went from 5.5 seconds, we're now down to a second. And again, all the measurements here look vastly improved. And if I go look at the waterfall again, here I happen to be using HTTPS, which you can see here. And I did that because you need to use HTTPS to use HTTP2. So I'm using HTTP2, so it takes a little longer to get my connection established. But once it does, we'll talk about HTTP2 in detail later, all of the stuff can download in parallel. And if I go back and show you the video, we can see instead of 5 seconds, it's completely visible in about a second. So that's the motivation. That's how I measure. I can do before and after. Web page test keeps these results. So as you saw, I can just keep this URL, make a favorite to it, and keep referring to it. So every time I'm doing performance changes, I like to get the before and the after, and I save these 2 URLs, and then I can send to my marketing people and say, here are the links to the 2 videos. Watch visually what I did for performance, how that had an impact on customers. So once I have some measurements, I have to decide, am I good enough, right? Is everything going as fast as I want? Amazon and Walmart happened to do some testing. They intentionally slowed their website by only 100 milliseconds, so 1/10 of a second, because they wanted to know how sensitive customers were to performance. And they both saw the same number. 1/10 of a second cost them 1% of their sales. So it's important to understand for your customers and the users of your website, how sensitive are they to performance. So you may want to do that kind of A/B testing and determine for yourself, but it's important to know that performance matters to people, as evidenced by things like this. There's also some good URLs you can use here to compare yourself to your competitors. So I'm going to go to this one. SpeedCurve is a vendor that does measurements, RUM measurements of websites. It's a little hard to read this. I just wanted to show, I'll zoom in here a little bit. This is on a fast connection. You can just get an idea, once you know how you are from web page tests, how fast you are, you can come out here and say on a fast connection, this is Target, here's Walmart, Amazon, etc. So you can compare yourself, and then you can also look and say if you're on a slow connection, it takes Amazon about 7 seconds before you see stuff. So just get some numbers for yourself. You can go out there and compare yourself. I also like to use this other site that I referenced there, which is if you come out here, you can actually punch in your URL. I'm not going to do it here because it takes a little while to run. But if you put in your URL, Google Chrome on mobile devices is sending telemetry. So if you're using Chrome on your phone and you opted in, you're sending information to Google. They use that so that they can tell me what users experience. So you can think of it as a partial RUM for all the Chrome users on mobile devices for free. So I can come out here, punch in my domain. So I've used this recently. We made some major changes to our website, and I could come out here and say before I did everything, it took about 5 seconds. After I was completely done, I was down to 2 seconds. So it's a nice metric to use to talk to people about real user experiences. And again, that's available for free. And the last note is, again, when do you quit, right? When is it good enough? I could spend another 5 years tweaking minor performance things. You're going to typically see a lot of huge advantages from some of the techniques I'll show you right away. It gets harder and harder as you go, right? Each next tweak, I went from 5 seconds to 2 seconds recently. Getting from 2 now down to 1 usually is a lot more work. So that's kind of the background, the measurements. Now we'll start just talking about various techniques. So the first one is HTTP compression. So what happens with this is every device and browser will send an accept encoding that tells the server whether it handles compression. And today, virtually every device knows how to do compression. So I had turned this on probably 15 years ago or so, and not every device supported it. If you turn this on and the device doesn't support it, that's fine. It just won't do compression. But what compression does is it just takes your content and makes it a lot smaller. So when I turned this on for our web server years ago, we found out the next day we cut our bandwidth usage in half. So just by setting this setting, I saved half of all the bandwidth to my e-commerce site. And then I also saw by synthetic measurements that I was 25% faster. So let's take a look at what in Fiddler. So if I go back to our after version here, I'm going to look at Bootstrap. And if I go to the inspectors, I can see this little yellow bar. That just tells me I've got compression on. So I have gzip compression on. And you can see that that file was about 36K. Had I not used compression, you'll see it was about 160K. So I went from 160K down to 37K over the wire. So people who have slow connections, I've just saved them a lot of download time just by turning on that setting. I know everybody uses different types of server products. I'm not going to get into all the details of exactly how you set this, but in IIS, Apache, any of the web servers you want to use, it's very straightforward to set the actual compression and say what techniques you want. There's a newer one called Brotli. So if I were to click on this, you'd see I'd go from 36K down to 17K. So it's got better compression. It's a little slower, and today it's not supported by IIS. So I still run my site on IIS, so I don't use this. I use gzip. But you can play with which one is a good trade-off for you and which one makes sense. But it's very simple to turn this on. And by the way, I'm going to show you techniques. Quick hitters, easy, and very effective first. So if you don't use compression today, start there. It's going to make a huge difference. The next one I want to talk about is content expiration. So the idea with this one is you come and visit my website. I want you the second time you come back. So if you come today, you've got to get my HTML, all my images, all my JavaScript. If you come back tomorrow, I want you to make one request. I would like you to come back and run my page, my ASP.NET page again, because maybe something changed on the server or in the database, right? But if nothing changed, I want you to just get that one file. I want to use your browser's cache. Because if you came yesterday and you already have all of these images in JavaScript and CSS, why would I want you to download all of those again? So the way expirations work, you can set expiration times on your content folders. So if I go back to Fiddler again, they have a caching column. You can see my before site didn't actually do any expiration, so there's no caching. But you can see in my after site, this is in seconds. I'm telling the browser to keep my Bootstrap and my carousel CSS for a year and keep the images for 30 days. So what that does now is if you came yesterday, hit my site, because I specifically put these rules in there, it won't ask for these files again. If you don't do that, what happens is you're leaving it up to the individual browser and what they call heuristics, where the browser is going to make its own decision. So if you ever do traces and you see a request that says if modified since and you get back a 304 response, you basically wasted a call to the server only to find out the file wasn't changed. So again, this saved me a lot of bandwidth, super fast. It's not going to be any faster than pulling it right off the device. It saves me bandwidth. It's a great technique. If it turns out that I changed one of these files, let's say I changed my London file here, or even this one, you can see the jQuery has a version number in it. If I got a new version of jQuery tomorrow, this will have a different version number. So as long as I change the URL, anything on the URL, I can make it override the browser cache. So in that jQuery example, you might have that cached already. Great. If you come to the server and I now use jQuery 4.x or whatever, that won't be in the browser cache. And because that's part of the URL, it'll come to the server. So that's how you get the best of both worlds. Set up caching, but if you absolutely have to override browser caches, just change the URL in some way, the file name, hash, any way you want to do that, so that it overrides the browser cache for that particular file. So again, that's a very handy technique. The next thing to focus on is having a content delivery network. So I find it interesting that the internet went on for a long time. Two people in a bar basically got in an argument about which one matters most, bandwidth or latency. So you can go read this article. And what they did is they said, let's make the bandwidth faster. Every time you go to an ISP, they say, we have 100 megabits per second. Or, they're always advertising the bandwidth part of it. Well, it turns out that bandwidth matters for a little while. Once you get to a certain amount of bandwidth, you're not really improving the speed that much. However, what really matters is the latency. So the latency is how long it takes to communicate between you and the server. So distance matters for latency. So I can't make it, so I have my data center in Minnesota, and you're in Africa. I'm not going to I don't want you to have to travel all the way to Minnesota for every one of my files. So what I want to do instead is if I use a CDN, it's a global network of servers. I'm going to set up with the CDN, and what will happen is the first person, let's say one of you visited my website today, it's going to go find the closest server in my CDN network. Once it finds that, my files probably aren't there yet. Nobody's visited my site. Once you hit that site, it's going to pull those files from my server. It's going to store them then on that CDN server in Africa. So now the second person who visits, you're going to be able to get it directly from there, somewhere close to you, rather than have to come all the way back to my server. So it's a very good way to deal with the latency problem. So again, I've used this for years. I use it for static files. So we've hosted our images, our CSS, our JavaScript. We host our fonts today. I'll talk about the font impact in a bit, but CDNs are a very handy way to reduce latency. So if I go show you an example what that would look like. So in the cdn.htm, there are a lot of different CDN vendors. So I'm just pretending I have one called cdn.example.com. Once I set up with a CDN vendor, they'll give me a unique domain name. So instead of referencing my images relatively like I would, I just have to do it using that domain name. And then the magic of the CDN is when it does a DNS lookup of that name, it's going to find the closest CDN server to your location and give you back the IP address of that CDN server, and therefore all of your requests should come from much closer to you. And like I said, if it's not been populated, that server yet, that server will come and get it from me and cache it there. So that's a CDN. Again, the nice thing is there are a lot of them, and they compete, and so the price keeps dropping. So it's pretty easy to get a contract where I can get a CDN vendor that gives me all the latency benefits, the performance benefits, offloads all the work from my bandwidth, and typically the prices are lower than what I'm paying for bandwidth myself. So it's a nice play in a lot of different ways. Next thing to focus on is bundling and minification. So I put the bundling in italics, and I'll explain why in a minute, but we'll focus on minification first. So minification just takes your CSS, your JavaScript. I said possibly HTML. I know people do it. When you minimize HTML, it can affect your layout. And for ASP.NET, I have not found a good way to do the minification on the fly, so I don't do this, the HTML, but I minify my CSS and JavaScript. So let's look at what that looks like again. So I'll show you the before version. If I were to look at, say, bootstrap.js, you can see it's about 134K. If you look at my after version, the Bootstrap minified is about 60K. So if you haven't seen minified before, there's tons of tools you can do in your build process. As an example, when I download Bootstrap, I had the choice to pick minified. I just always choose minified, and that's what it looks like. They take all the comments out because browsers don't care, right? They don't care that this looks pretty. If I need to troubleshoot this on the client, so I use the new Microsoft Edge. You can do it in Chrome as well, most of the dev tools. If I'm troubleshooting and I don't want to see it minified, those tools have a way to unminify or pretty print it, which will get back to a version that looks more readable so I can still troubleshoot it. So I just use minified files all the time. I'll talk about the bundling. So in the past, for HTTP 1.1, we were talking about reducing the number of HTTP requests. I mentioned when I showed you web page test, in HTTP 1.1, you get 6 connections to each domain. And because of that, you needed to try to reduce how many requests you made. So I actually took all of my CSS files and bundled them into a single CSS file. And I did the same with my JavaScript. I have a couple JavaScript bundles, 2 or 3 of them, because I have one in the header and one in the footer. When I did the minification and bundling, my homepage was 46% faster, and it took about 6 hours of work using free tools. So part of my build process is I always get Bootstrap minified from the vendor, but my own JavaScript files, when I build my website, it takes them and minifies them, and then bundles them all into a single JavaScript and a single CSS file with a version number, and then it takes advantage of my caching. So when I do all of that, if you visit my site, you're going to get a very small JavaScript file once. It'll keep it in your cache forever, basically for a year, or until I change it. And again, it's just that much faster. So we'll talk about bundling. I'm about to drop bundling because of HTTP 2, but today, still focus on doing minification. The next big area for opportunity is images. A lot of websites, like 60-some%, if you go out to HTTP archive, of most web page sizes are due to images. So the first rule is avoid if possible. So years ago, we had designers that wanted a certain font for typefaces, and they just weren't available back then. So they actually would take text, make it into an image in the font they wanted, and put the image on our website instead. And that hurt us for SEO and a lot of different reasons. Now that web fonts are available, we don't want to do that. We also used to use images to do gradients and things. So the main messages are images can be heavy. So if you can find another way with CSS3 to use those techniques and not use images, do that, because they're going to be smaller. If you do use images, make sure you pick the proper type. So if you're doing something that's a logo, something that used to be a GIF, for instance, use SVG. SVG is a vector graphic, and it works very good for logos, and it scales. So even if I'm on a phone, tablet, so I'm a responsive website, I need to look good at all sorts of different sizes, and SVG will automatically scale. It's mathematical rather than a bitmap. So as I'm on a phone, tablet, desktop, TV, whatever, that will always scale to look good because it's drawn using math. So if you're doing a logo, use SVG. If you're using photos, use JPEGs. I will acknowledge that there is WebP, which is a little smaller than JPEGs, and there's now a brand new one that just launched this week, AVIF, which is available in Chrome and I think Firefox as of a couple days ago. Those are great. They're a lot smaller. They're just not supported everywhere. So for my site, I'm still using JPEGs. I'll talk about how you could use those other formats if you want, but let's just focus on, I have gotten into some arguments in the past with people about using PNGs instead of JPEGs. I just want to show you. I went to Australia, and you can walk up their bridge. So here's the JPEG version of that. If I open the PNG version, you'll see it visually looks the same, but if you look on disk here, the JPEG is 58K, the PNG is about 500K. So if in doubt and you think that it's going to work, and this is even optimized with tiny PNG, JPEGs can be made much smaller because you can control the compression. And so again, if you doubt it, make them both. If it turns out your PNG is smaller for some reason, great. In general, I haven't seen that, so make sure you're picking the right formats makes a big difference. Also use responsive images. So I talked about we have to look good on a phone and a tablet and desktops and everywhere else. Years ago, what happened with when responsive design first came out is people would use the image tag because that's all we had, and they would use a really large image because they think it's going to, I might need that because it's on a desktop. However, what happened was phones that have typically worse connections actually were downloading huge images and then scaling them down to display on a phone. So they did a lot of work with browser vendors to do responsive images. So I'll show you quickly how I do that. So again, I'm in the after version of the code. And if I scroll down here, you'll see I'm using source set. Ignore the data dash for a minute, we'll get to that. But now with source set available, I can create various sizes of the same image. And then I just reference all of them here. And I let the browser make the choice that makes the most sense. So how big is the screen? How fast is the network connection? All of that comes into play. I'm a very controlling sort of person. So when this first came out, I thought, I really hate having browsers make all those choices for me. But I embraced it. I did it. If you notice, I put the size right in the file name. So when I look at my web logs, I can see which ones are being downloaded the most. But I'm telling it here, I have this one at 128. Here's the largest one. So why does this matter? If we go back and look at these sizes, the 128 width version is only 2K. The 2048 width is 187K. That's a huge difference. I mean, that's 100 times larger by not having the right size. So if I happen to come to my site now and I'm on a phone, really small phone, possibly with a bad connection, I'm still going to see the bridge picture, but I only had to download 2K, not 187K. So when I mentioned I'm not going to be able to show it here, you can find examples. If you want to use WebP or AVIF, you'd use the picture tag because the picture lets you say, I have an image, and it lets you do both the sizes and the formats. So you can say, I've got all of these sizes, but I also have a JPEG, a WebP, and an AVIF, and the browser will pick the right one. I just don't use this yet. It's a lot of work to get all of those different image formats created, and the picture tag's a little bit more verbose. So I just choose to still use JPEGs, but I'll show you some of the JPEG techniques that you can use. So the first good thing about JPEGs is you can compress them. So you can trade off size versus quality. So every time I say that to one of my designers, they kind of freak out. I tell them, I'll make a deal with you. If you can tell me which one of these is the original image and which one is the one that I compressed that I want to use, if you can actually tell me the real one, the original one, I'll use it. And if you can't tell the difference, you let me use the small one. So I threw in a couple easy ones that really look bad, right? But if you look at the rest of these, it's pretty hard to tell, even side by side, which image is which. So if I hover, here's the original one that was about 172K. I have this one. I did some compression. So I use PaintShop Pro, and I don't have time yet to show you how to do that. Any paint program will let you do this. But if you go into the program, you can say save as a JPEG, run an optimizer. Most of the tools will show you a side-by-side version of the image with a little slider. So you can just play with the slider, compress it, and it'll keep showing you the quality of the image and the size. So you just tweak it till you get to that point where it's a lot smaller. I mean, again, this one is 47K, that's 172, so I'm about a third the size. This one I'm going to talk about, I did a little bit more work as well, but visually I've got it a lot smaller. You can't tell, really. Your customers don't. I mean, if you have a photography website where it has to be absolutely precise, or art, that's a different discussion. But for normal websites, this is a good trade-off to make. I'll talk about progressive JPEGs next. So I'm going to go back to Fiddler here. Fiddler has the ability to act slow. So I'm going to simulate modem speeds. And I'm going to show you two versions of a JPEG, and you can tell me which one you like better. So on the left, I'm using what's called a progressive JPEG. On the right, I'm using traditional JPEGs. Most JPEGs on the internet are this type. It's the standard kind. What progressive lets you do, it encodes the JPEG differently so that it paints slowly. So I'll do it again so you can see. It paints the whole image quickly, kind of fuzzy, and then it improves the quality compared to the baseline ones paint line by line. So if you're somebody visiting a website, the left side looks right there like it's done. That's a huge difference. If people are on slow connections for you, using progressive JPEGs could be a huge advantage. So we used to use it, so I've done web for a long time. We used to use it back in the modem days. It's getting a bit of a revival now. And again, I use PaintShop Pro. When I go in there, I can just say save as, and progressive JPEG is one of the choices for me. So I'm investigating this right now. We have a lot of mobile users on our website now. We're looking into whether we want to take all of our product photos and switch them to be progressive JPEG. So at some point, I hope to be able to test that and see how well that works. The next thing to look at is image optimizers. So I just listed one of them here that I use called JPEG Tran. If you're familiar, I will pull up this image. So I have the same image here. If I look at a normal JPEG and I go into the details, you'll see it has a bunch of stuff about what camera I use, the shutter speed. They call that metadata. None of my customers care about that, right? It just adds to download. So if I look at the size of this is 47K. I took all of that out using JPEG Tran. So there's lots of tools that do this again. JPEG Tran's just a command line tool. I told it to remove the metadata. It went from 46K down to 31K. And if I go back into the details, you can see that all that stuff was removed. Again, it doesn't visually help, so why make people download it? I'll give you the only warning on that. If you buy copyrighted images, some of the people who sell them say that they don't want you to remove the metadata because it has their copyright data in it. But if they're your images on your own, there's no reason to show this. I will show you a way to find out if you have this problem. So if you go out to Fiddler's website, you can get an extension called image bloat. So I'm going to turn on image bloat. I'm going to go to a web page I have. I'll probably have to hit, I got to hit Control F5. And I'm sorry I left my slow modem speed on. I'll turn that off in a second. But what image bloat does is it finds out if your image has metadata in it, and it shows you with these little bricks how much of that image is metadata. So you can see 15% of this image is that metadata that doesn't affect the visual quality. So again, removing that saved me, in that case, 15%. Let me turn off that slow speed. I'll turn off. So if you want to check your website to see if you have too much image data or metadata, just go get that image bloat, turn it on here, hit your web pages, and it'll tell you if you have too much metadata. Another technique we've used for a long time is called image lazy loading. And so the idea is, if I look at my web page, we'll go back to the after version here. This was the above the fold I talked about that speed index is measuring. I also have these images down below. And what I want to do is, if you come and visit my site, I want this top part to paint as fast as it can. I don't want it to be downloading these images, because you may or may not scroll, right? If you came here and, hey, Stockholm looks cool, and you leave, then I downloaded this stuff for no reason. So I use this plugin called Lazy Sizes. It's very popular. It's free. I have the JavaScript version. What I do is, instead of using source, I just use data-source, and I include this JavaScript file. So I'll show you what that looks like in code. So that's why I had data-source set here. This is one of the images below. So what it does is the browser sees this, but because it has data source sets, it doesn't try to download this because there's no actual source or source set on this image. When I include this JavaScript down here, now that tells it as soon as the browser starts to scroll down and this image is about to be visible, it changes that data-source set to source set, which makes the browser then do its magic and figure out what image to download, and it downloads it on the fly. So let's see that in action. If we go back to Fiddler, and I'm going to I'm going to clear my browser cache here to make sure that I don't have stuff cached. Don't know why that's taking so long. Okay, so if I come back and hit Control F5 and we go look at Fiddler, we can see I've made some requests. I'm just going to mark where we were so it stands out. Now as I go back to the browser, as I scroll down, there's those three images. And you can see one of them it had actually downloaded ahead of time, now went and got those other two. So it uses its own logic about how far down below the fold is, and you can tweak it to say when you want it to download. But if you look, that's 190K that I didn't need to download if you didn't happen to scroll down. So that's very worth using. I'll mention to you there is native support. Again, this came out within the last year, that you don't have to actually use a plugin. The problem is that it's not completely supported. So if you haven't been out to Can I Use before, caniuse.com, you can punch in HTML5 and CSS attributes and it'll show you how well supported it is. And you can see for me, I'm trying to get rid of I11, but I still have a lot of customers that are using iOS and Safari. Safari does not support this new lazy loading attribute yet. So if I started to use it, I would have to have a polyfill anyways. So I just, from a practical standpoint, I'm sticking with lazy sizes for now. I just want you to know that there is native support, that someday, hopefully we can drop the plugin and it'll just be built into the browsers. The next one is deferred loading. So this is something I actually had to write myself. So we have a lot of third-party content on our website. And I don't want all of that stuff to download, so things like analytics or ad tracking, whatever the stuff is, I don't want that to affect the paint for my customer. So I want to download that after the onload has occurred. So you can look at it, it's in this load deferred. I just wrote a little JavaScript snippet. And I'm looking for, if you put a data-deferred source or source set, you can also use it on iframes. You can extend this to do more than what I did. I just wanted to give you an example. Now I have this JavaScript file. So here's an example of a third-party JavaScript file. I don't want that to be downloading and potentially affecting my paint. So by putting on this data deferred, I'll show you what it'll do in Fiddler. Another trick in Fiddler, I can make things intentionally slow. So I'm going to go to the autoresponder, and I set up a rule that says if you try to download empty.js, which is right here, I'm going to make that intentionally take a long time so that you can see that this is not downloading right away. It's going to wait until all the other stuff is downloaded. So I turn that on in Fiddler. If I go back to the browser here and run that, here you can see it's sitting on this empty.js. It's still running. So it's just showing you that I can defer things. So I've deferred lately a lot of third-party images, content, beacons, anything that's not required for my paint. I can actually defer. So you see it did eventually get downloaded. It just didn't impact the main critical path for my rendering. So that's a cool technique. There's also been some additions to JavaScript in the last few years. So JavaScript by itself, if I'm downloading it, will block my rendering. So if I pull up this page, I've got these 3 JavaScript files. I'm going to go back into Fiddler and make those 3 files be slow. I'm going to go request that page. And what's important to notice is I had some content in there. My customer is seeing a completely blank page because those JavaScript files are slowing things up. Now you can see my content. What async and defer let you do is you can tell you're basically telling the browser, these JavaScript downloads they're not important for the page paint. So let them be downloaded and executed kind of in the background. So it's similar to what I was doing with deferred. My deferred technique actually makes sure it happens after onload. These techniques just say, we don't care when it happens, just don't wait to show content. Let them happen. So I'm going to go add that. So if I come on here and say I want these to be async, and again, if your browser doesn't support it, no harm done, right? Your browser will just wait like it does today. But if I put on async and I go back to the page, I hit Control F5, you notice the content is painted right away. That's the important thing, these JavaScript files. A couple other notes, I intentionally slowed the JavaScript in a different order. So the second one finished first, then the third one, then the first. So that's what's important about async, as I said, download them in the background. Please don't let it affect your paint. That's what's important. My customer sees their stuff right away. These are not needed for the paint, so make them async. The async says they don't need to execute in order. So it turned out that the way I delayed things, if I go back in Fiddler here, I delayed the first one by 4 seconds, the second one by 2 seconds, so that one's going to finish first. So you saw the alert came up for this one first. That's what async does. If I have to actually control the order, I should use defer. Show you in my actual code example for the after version. You can see I'm taking advantage of defer and async. It turns out that Bootstrap needs jQuery. So that one I want to use defer. So I told it, download jQuery, get the Bootstrap, JavaScript. That doesn't affect my paint, so defer them. That's good. But I did defer because I don't want Bootstrap to try to run before jQuery runs, or it's not going to work. because it needs it. So that's why those two are defer. Lazy sizes is just a normal JavaScript file, so I can use async. So again, just techniques to make things paint faster when I'm loading. Next cool thing that browsers have added is what's called resource hints. So I'm going to show you an example of what this one looks like. So I've got this JavaScript file down here that I want to download from ajax.microsoft.com. And what I want to do is these techniques tell my browser ahead of time. Like if I use DNS prefetch, I'm telling the browser, as soon as you get to this line, please go start figuring out the DNS resolution for ajax.microsoft.com. So rather than wait until the HTML gets down here, I'm telling it earlier, go out there. So that's cool. I would prefer to do this, pre-connect. And with pre-connect, I'm saying go establish a connection that uses HTTPS. So when I showed you the waterfall diagram, it takes a while to set up a connection. You got to do a DNS lookup. You need to do the HTTPS for security. So by doing the pre-connect, I'm telling it, start that early because you're going to eventually need it, which is cool. Another one, so I don't actually have a use case for this yet. If you came to this page, and I was pretty confident you were going to go to this page next, like the flow of my website just dictates that you're going to go there next, you can actually set this pre-render hint. The browser will go not only connect, it will go get default.htm, it will get all the JavaScript images, fonts, whatever's on that page, and it will start to pre-render it. So while I'm sitting looking at this page, in the background it's going and getting the next page ready. So if I do actually follow a link and go to this page, it would pop up almost instantly because it's already got all the files. So if you happen to have a website that does that, you might want to look into that. I don't have that type of traffic pattern that I know where you're going to go next. So I don't use that technique, because if you start going nuts with that technique, you might be downloading all of this stuff in the background and ruining someone's data plan, and they never go to those pages. So be careful about when you use it, but it might make sense for you in certain places. Some quick miscellaneous things. I'm focused on critical rendering path now. So that goes back to the techniques that I talked about in the loading. Let's go back to this one. It's really important, both JavaScript and CSS will block the rendering of my page. So in the past, they said put CSS in the header, put JavaScript in the bottom to try to deal with that. Both of these two CSS files are needed to paint the top of my page. If it turned out they weren't, I could do this trick, media equals print. That tells the browser that, yes, I need this CSS file, but this is just how it works today. You're basically saying, don't block rendering while I wait for that CSS. But both of mine happen to be used. But I did the JavaScript at the bottom and did all of that async and defer work because I'm focused on the critical rendering path. I want that page to paint as fast as I can. That's what's important on my website. Another thing to be aware of is URLs are case sensitive, if you didn't know that. So I've got 4 images on this page. 2 of them are all lowercase, but 2 of them have different, like I have a capital F on this one, capital B, and then this one just has a capital F. If I make this request, let me go into Fiddler. So that's the exact same image. And the important thing to notice is it downloaded that same exact image 3 times. And that's because casing matters. So we just made the rule for us. Everything in our URLs have to be lowercase. It's easier for developers to remember. And by doing that, because otherwise, if no one's probably going to do this, right? I'm not going to put the same 4 images, but it is pretty typical that on one page, I might have used this technique. On another page, another developer used this. Well, everything I talked about earlier, like caching and keeping it in your browser, you came and got it when I did it like the top one, and then the other developer went and used the other, and it had to re-download it all, even though it already had it. So just be aware that URLs are case sensitive, and I would set up standards to make sure people follow the same rules so that you're not over-downloading. I'm going to skip the strict transport security for the moment. I'll mention font subsetting. So I do use web fonts on our sites. It turned out that one of our websites had a pretty large font. And when we looked at that web font, it turned out that there were a lot of Asian character sets in it, which we didn't need for our US-based website. So I went out to, I happen to use Font Squirrel. You can actually go in, look at your fonts, and slice them up and optimize your font. So I got a 2 meg font file down to about 28K by removing a bunch of language support in fonts that I didn't need because it was a English-only US website. So just be aware if you're using fonts, there are techniques for you to slice up those font files and do subsetting, which could make a big difference for your download size. So we've talked about HTTP2. I've got full hour talks on this, so we don't have that much time to go into it. The important part of it from a performance standpoint is this line. In the past, like I said, HTTP 1.1, the actual spec, said browsers should open at most 2 connections to each host, and you can download one thing on each connection. So if you came to my website and I had 20 images, it would open up 2 connections, it would get the first 2 images, and then you'd have to wait. In HTTP2, they said so basically the browsers started cheating, and instead of using 2, they all use 6, because it would be 3 times faster, right? They could download up to 6 stuff at a time. HTTP2 said, let's get away from all of these connections. It takes a while to set up a connection and make it fast. Let's use just one connection and download everything over that connection. So I gotta close Fiddler here. I want to show you an example of why HTTP2 matters. So I'm going to show you 2 different examples. So this one is a decent example. I don't love it. You can see that this page has 360 small images on it. If you use HTTP non-secured, it uses HTTP 1.1. You see it took about 3.5 seconds. If you use HTTPS, you can support HTTP2, so you can see the difference. It was 83% faster by using HTTP2, even though it had to do encryption. The only reason I don't love this example, I don't have a web page that has 360 small images on it, so it's a little bit skewed. But it is true, by having just one connection, you don't have to wait. So I'm going to show you another one that I like that also talks about latency. So this page shows you HTTP2 versus 1. And I talked about why latency was important earlier and why HTTP2. So that's HTTP2 with a 30 millisecond latency. That's HTTP 1.1. You get to see it paint in chunks because, again, these are a bunch of separate images, and HTTP 1 needed to wait for some of its connections. The worse your latency is, the slower your latency is, the more obvious it is. So the point is, HTTP 2 is cool. You only need one connection. If you're very latency sensitive, if you have a lot of people that have bad latency on their connections, HTTP2 can make a huge difference for your site. So I talked about once you do HTTP2, these are a lot of performance techniques that people have used in the past to avoid problems with the connection limit. So I used this one. I bundle all my JavaScript and CSS files into single files, and I was doing that solely to get around this connection limit. Now that we have HTTP2, there's been a lot of debate in the community about, should we just not bundle at all? Should we bundle less? You can go find a lot of different research. I'm going to stop doing one big bundle. There are still some compression benefits, so I'm looking more to bundle similar JavaScript files that belong together in certain areas of my website. Still do maybe 5 bundles or 10 smaller bundles instead of one big bundle. The point is just do some measurements. You'll see these performance recommendations in the past that you probably don't want to do anymore once you do HTTP2, because they were solely around reducing the number of requests, and that is not as big a deal anymore with HTTP2. There's a lot of good tools out there for performance. Google PageSpeed was out for a long time. You can go out and follow this URL. You can punch in your URL, and it does both lab and field data, so both measurements and user experience. So actual Chrome users using your site gets weighed into this. I'm going to show you this instead, which is called Lighthouse. So if I go back to my browser, I can hit F12, and I'm on the Lighthouse tab. So Lighthouse lets you run a lot of scans against your web page. So let me go to my performance before. And it has a lot of stuff, SEO, accessibility. I'm just going to do a performance mobile and hit generate report. And what it's going to do is it's going to go give me a score about how well my site does for performance. And then it's going to, the cool part is, okay, so I scored a 68, which isn't horrible. The cool thing is that if you roll down here, it tells you things that you should do. So all the stuff we talked about so far in the talk, right? Turn on compression, minify your JavaScript, get rid of CSS you don't need, minify your CSS, make your images be the right sizes. It'll show you it took images and tried to make them smaller. And it's hard for a tool to guess, right, when it's not as visible or when it's blurry. So you saw I did a lot better compression than they're saying. But it's cool because I can come out here and run it, and it'll tell me the top things that I should focus on that line up with stuff we talked about in this talk. If I go run the after version, if all is right in the world here, sweet, still 100. So I still have recommendations. I mean, there's still some things that, it tells me this bootstrap, the 2 things at the top, that CSS file is blocking my rendering. I know that, right? I need bootstrap for this to show up, right? So that's acceptable. But again, it's nice before and after I make performance improvements. I like to get the Lighthouse score because it's something good to report internally to our marketing people and say, look, before we were at 68, now we're at 100. So the performance things we're doing, people can measure and say that we've made improvements. And then I've showed you Fiddler, how to do autoresponder already. Another thing I'll mention in Chrome and Edge, if you want to intentionally slow your entire thing, I can come in here and say, please act like you're on a slow 3G. It's a little different than the Fiddler. In Fiddler, I was targeting specific files. So I was saying, I want the CSS to be slow, so I can see what that does to paint. This just lets you set and say, act like the whole site is connected with 3G, just so you can see what the experience would be like for a customer that way. Some quick resources. So I've got some Pluralsight courses. I'm a Pluralsight author. I've got about 9 courses. I have one on web performance that goes into more detail, shows you how to do the JPEG compressions and a lot of the other fill in the gaps. Today I cared that these techniques are out there. You could see what a huge difference they make when you apply them properly. Most of those techniques are detailed in that web performance course. I also have one on images that goes into the image types and how to do the responsive images, and some more on compression. My most recent one is debugging your website with Fiddler and Chrome DevTools, and I also have one on Fiddler if you're interested in those. Again, that's my Twitter, my email, my blog, and that's the link for the slides and the code. So again, I gave you the code before and after and all of these slides. So it looks like we have about 5 minutes or so left on our time. If there were any specific questions people wanted to review.
I haven't received any questions, but if
Okay.
anyone has a question, you can just come out of mute and ask your question.
And if you'd like I said, you can reach me on any of those techniques there. Probably Twitter is probably the best, or you can email me if after the talk you start looking through the code and you have questions about stuff. You can ask me there as well.
Sure.
Hello, I do have a question. What is the impact of optimizing the performance of the website to the security of the website?
Okay, so the question was, is security impacted by the performance techniques that I did? So everything that I showed today should not any difference. I'm going to get out of this just so I can pop through here. I did not use any techniques in here that should reduce your security. So all of these things, compression, expirations, the only one that you could argue a little is the CDN. So by using a CDN, you're hosting your images and your JavaScript files out on someone else's servers, right? And there's a small risk that if somebody attacked my CDN server, they could modify my JavaScript files. There is a technique called sub-resource integrity, SRI. So if you look that up, there's a way to compute a hash of your JavaScript files. I want to do that for mine because I do host on the CDN. I don't do it yet, but the browser will make sure that I create the HTML. I tell you what the hash of the JavaScript file should be. If anybody tampered with it on my CDN, the browser would reject it. So that's probably the only one. The rest, as I look through here, the rest of these things, the way we're loading images, we're optimizing images, we're minifying. None of these should make you any worse than what you were before. I came back to this. I didn't have enough time to do this before. This is a very good thing to do for security. So if you set up HTTPS, you can set up what's called strict transport security. So if someone comes to my site, types HTTP, comes to my site, I301 redirect them to use HTTPS. I also set this HSTS and I tell them don't ever come back to my site using HTTP. Their browser will keep track of that. So the next time they type HTTP or click a link, the browser will force it to communicate with HTTPS. And there's also a way to do preloading where you can say my site uses HTTPS. It will tell the browser vendors to bake your site into the browser so that anytime anybody types HTTP, it'll always use HTTPS. So that would be a good security improvement. But to answer the question, I haven't shown you things that are going to weaken your security. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll go back to the last slide in case people need to see the links.
Okay, it seems like we do not have any further questions. In case of anything, you can just reach out to Robert. Thank you, Robert, for such an informative session.
You're welcome.
I believe we can have a series of these and we'll discuss together with my team and we'll reach out to you in the next coming days with information about these.
Okay, sounds great. Like I said, if anybody wants to, please follow up with me, and I appreciate you having me here today.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone.
Yep.